The black tray creaked open in the middle of the long table, and beneath a layer of spicy salt appeared the charred head of a bull covered in soot and resin. The musicians stopped playing. The wine tasted cold. Those who knew the ancient symbol turned pale. It meant a sentence that wasn't spoken. A metallic smell came to the doors, and the air got thick, like before a storm. I'm glad you're here. Write in the comments where you're watching this video from. It's important for me to know who is sitting next to me at this big table of history. Enjoy listening. From early morning, the castle smelled of baked turnips, smoked fish, and wet wool. People carried water from the well, the cook argued with a boy over the spit, and the old key-keeper repeated that the chains on the gate must lie flat, otherwise trouble would enter the house. It was one of those days when everything seems familiar, and only small details give quiet signs. The raven on the roof did not fly away, even when the bells rang from the tower to announce the feast. Someone left a dropped ribbon with a thin embroidery in the form of a knot, very similar to the coat of arms of a neighboring family, on the stone windowsill of the kitchen. No one noticed that the ribbon smelled of incense, although the kitchen never smelled of incense. The boy at the spit was called Myron. He was quiet and swarthy, spoke little, moved quickly, and rarely looked anyone in the eye. He was considered a nobody, an orphan from the road, found at the gates of the monastery during a year of great drought. He washed pots, cleaned fish, and put dry branches on the coals, which he saved for even heat. No one knew that Myron had a secret habit. At night, he learned to read from an old scribe, hiding a broken stylus and scraps of parchment under the straw in a corner. The scribe said that he saw rare patience in the boy, and also said that patience is sharper than a knife when it comes to cutting through lies. Myron believed that the words on the scroll were like breadcrumbs leading to a door where the light was always on. On the same day, a woman in a dark cloak arrived at the castle. She was known in the city as a stone merchant, but she was not just a merchant. Her name was Elsa, and she knew how to look at her interlocutor's hands as if she could read what he was hiding. It was said that she once bought an entire family out of slavery, and it was also said that she never haggled over candles for memorial services. Rings with green glass stones resembling emeralds sparkled on her fingers, but those with sharp eyes could see that the settings contained simple stones, and that the real value was hidden deeper, in her knowledge of whom to give money to and when, in order to restore justice. Elsa came to the feast at the invitation of the treasurer, because the treasurer was planning to marry off his nephew and wanted to show the rich guests his new jewels. No one noticed how Elsa, passing by the kitchen, lingered her gaze on Myron and nodded slightly, as if recognizing an old sign. The mistress of the castle was Lady Agnes. Her husband had died many years ago on the border, and she kept the house firmly, but without cruelty. She had a daughter, Adela, who was known in the city as the most beautiful woman, and outside the walls as kind-hearted, because she knew how to be attentive where others passed by. In the Russian and Polish quarters, she often visited the courtyards, brought herbs for colds, and knew how to stop bleeding and bandage wounds. She had been taught this by the local midwife, Malava, a thin and quiet woman with narrow palms, who kept herbs dried under her window and old secrets in her house. Malava said that every life is a pattern of threads, and there is always a knot where you least expect it. By evening, the castle was bustling with activity. Guests had arrived, knights from neighboring lands, venerable men from the monastic community, merchants who were always friends with those who controlled the roads. Among the guests were 2 young lords from a family with whom Lady Agnes had an old dispute. The dispute concerned land by the river and had been going on since the days when each coat of arms had its own ancient mark. The young lords were called Bran and Oliver. They arrived with a small retinue, confident that laughter, gold, and wine would smooth over any sharp corners in the conversation. The castle treasurer, a man attentive to detail, ran around all day with his keys on his belt, repeating that everything must be ready for the special game dish that would be served closer to midnight. There was a rumor among the servants that the treasurer had received a package that morning. The package was delivered by 2 men in cloaks from a covered wagon. They did not give their names, saying only that it was a gift from a benefactor. The key-keeper signed the slip of paper they handed him, even though he did not like to sign other people's papers. Miron saw the package being taken to the cellar and placed on the bottom shelf, where wine for special occasions was kept. He remembered the thin rope that tied the lid and the heavy wax seal with the imprint of a bull's head. The imprint was not simple. There was a barely noticeable line around the rim, as if made by someone who was not used to dealing with seals. Myron did not attach any importance to this, although at night this rim would float before his eyes like a fish's back in murky water. The feast began as usual. They poured grog, carved roast geese, and brought bread, still warm from the oven. The musicians played cheerful tunes, and Adela sat next to her mother, trying not to look at Bran, although he had been catching her eye all evening. She felt a twinge of anxiety when she saw the treasurer exchanging glances with a man in the corner whose name she couldn't remember. This man had recently appeared at the castle, calling himself a scribe, but he held his pen awkwardly, like a sword. Malava, sitting closer to the door, counted in her mind how many candles were burning on the walls, because she knew that extra fire in a cramped hall could spell disaster. Just before midnight, Miron went down to the cellar for wine. There he found the treasurer standing by an open package. Inside was a tray covered with resin and salt. Miron asked how he could help, but the treasurer replied that extra eyes were not needed today. He ordered the old jugs to be removed from the shelf and the cellar to be aired out. Miron did as he was told, but noticed that the rope that had been tied around the lid had been replaced with a thicker one, and there was more sealing wax on the floor than would be left by a single impression. Miron picked up a small piece of sealing wax and saw that the double impression had been made with 2 different seals. The first was smooth, the second had a scratch at the bottom. He didn't tell anyone about this, although his heart sank, as if it were a bad omen. When the tray was brought into the hall, the game changed to a quiet one. The treasurer raised his hand, nodded to the scribe, and the latter brought a sharp knife to pry open the resin. At that moment, Elsa noticed 2 people in gray cloaks standing at the entrance to the hall, their boots wet, as if they had been standing in the courtyard in the rain for a long time, even though it had not been raining. Elsa moved the rings as she did when she was deciding which side of the scales held more truth. The tray opened. The smell of resin and burnt fat filled the air. The people saw the black head of the bull, and the hall fell silent. Those who knew the ancient custom understood the sign. The host was preparing to execute those sitting at his table, and he was doing so under the guise of honor, so as not to break the rules of hospitality with words, but to break them with deeds. All eyes fell on Bran and Oliver, because their family had borne the bull's head on their shield for centuries. The young lords turned pale, and the treasurer pretended to be as surprised as the others and said that he had not ordered this dish and that the benefactor must have wanted to emphasize peace. No one believed him. A commotion began, but Lady Agnes raised her hand, and everyone fell silent. She said through the steward that no harm would come to a guest in her castle without a trial, and that anyone could have brought the token to sow discord. She ordered the tray to be taken aside and the doors to be closed so that no one would run out and chase after the retinue. At that moment, Malava saw the treasurer's cheek twitch. She knew that tremor. A man who had gone halfway through a task was afraid of being caught for a trifle. She got up and went to the kitchen, even though it was not her place to do so. No one stopped her. People always let midwives pass, even when they go against the flow. In the kitchen, Malava found Miran. He was standing by the wall, rubbing a piece of sealing wax in his palm, on which there was a seal impression with a scratch. She asked him where he had found it. He explained that he had found it on the floor of the cellar. He added that he had seen 2 different impressions, one smooth, the other with a scratch. Malava thought for a moment and said that once, many years ago, she had been given a baby with a thin, carved pendant bearing the same bull's head symbol, but with a scratch under the right horn. She said that the baby had been brought to the monastery by a man in a cloak who did not want to give his name, and that she recognized Myron as the grown child who had been taken away that night. Myron heard this and felt as if his shoulder blades were pressed against cold stone. He realized that his life was connected to those who were about to be punished in the hall. The hidden kinship came to light not with a cry, but with a quiet coincidence of signs. While the meaning of the black sign was being debated in the hall, a thin thread of another ritual vibrated in the corridor. The man who called himself a scribe took a scroll with a seal out of his sleeve. He told the treasurer that the scroll contained an order for the immediate execution of 2 guests on charges of conspiracy. The treasurer nodded and said that it would be so. After the sign and the order, no one would resist. He ordered the guards to prepare the courtyard. This conversation was overheard by a maid with a lame leg named Leah. She worked at the clock tower and knew the cogs, screws, and ropes better than many men. She was considered strange and silent and was teased, but she knew the network of passages and secret doors built by Lady Agnes's grandfather. Leah realized that bloodshed was coming and ran to the kitchen. She found Malava and Miran and told them she had heard about the scroll. Miran asked to see it. Leah said she couldn't steal it, but she could show them the tunnel that led to the room where the scribe kept the papers. Elsa was standing at the door of the hall, watching the guests part and pretend they didn't understand anything, because it was easier to save their heads that way. Elsa realized she had time for one move. She went out into the hallway, found the kitchen, saw Malava, Miran, and Leah, and said she knew how to get the evidence, if it existed. She added that a purse and a name opened doors just as well as a key. The four of them descended a narrow staircase to a low door in the wall. Leah pressed a hidden stone, and the door opened. Behind the door was a narrow passageway that smelled musty. Miran walked ahead because he had light feet. He counted his steps and counted the turns, as the scribe who trained with him at night had taught him. If you think you'll get lost, count. The passage led them to a small window in the room where the scribe kept his papers. Through the bars, Leah pointed to the table. On the table lay a scroll with a seal. The seal had a scratch on it. Miran realized that this was the very seal that had replaced the imprint on the package. He put his eye to the crack and read the lines. They accused Bran and Oliver of conspiracy, referring to the testimony of a monk and the signature of Lady Agnes. The signature was similar, but the letter that always went down in her signature had a short stem here. Miran realized that the signature was forged. He realized something else, too. The lines between the lines were too even, as if the person had written without breathing, as usual. It was a forgery. Elsa said she had a plan. She took out a thin wire and a hook, retrieved the scroll through the bars without touching the seals. Miran whispered the text, and Elsa told him to memorize every letter and every place where the pen had faltered. Miran nodded. Leah showed another passageway that led to the chapel next to the hall. Malava said that now their job was not to make any noise, but to choose the right moment. In the hall, the treasurer was already raising his hand to signal the guards. Lady Agnes was unable to maintain order. People were frightened, and fear always hastens decisions. At that moment, Leah climbed up to the bell above the hall. She knew that if she struck the metal in a certain way, the crowd below would fall to their knees according to the old custom. She struck the bell high and long. The hall fell silent. Elsa entered the hall with a scroll. She told the steward that she had an important document and asked him to read it aloud. The steward refused because he was afraid of the treasurer. Then Elsa approached Lady Agnes and said that the scroll bore her signature, and that honor required her to look at her own name. Lady Agnes nodded. She looked at the scroll and turned pale. She said that in her signature, the tail of the letter was always long, like a willow branch, but here the tail was short, like a splinter. She realized it was a forgery. The treasurer tried to say that he had received orders from the scribe, and the scribe said that his brother had brought the paper from the monastery. A noisy wave began in the hall, but Elsa raised her hand, and the noise subsided like a wave at the shore. Miron stepped out of the shadows and said that the seal on the scroll had the same scratch as the seal on the package. He explained that he had seen 2 impressions in the cellar, which meant that someone had changed the lid. He added that the lady's signature was forged because he had learned to read and knew how the hand breathed when writing a real name. He spoke simply and evenly, and people listened. No one expected the cook's boy to be able to decipher seals and signatures. It was a hidden talent that had grown in the shadows of the kitchen. The treasurer flew into a rage and shouted that the boy was lying. But Mlava lifted the pendant with the bull's head, which she had kept for a long time, and said that many years ago there was a baby with this pendant on her table, and that the boy before them was the blood of the family against whom the execution had been prepared. She did not name names, but that was enough. The hidden kinship became as clear as the lines on the palm of her hand. The people began to murmur and whisper that the boy was a sign from above, not a coincidence. The treasurer realized that the net was breaking. He tried to leave, but Leia had already come down from the tower and stood by the side door, leaning on her cane. She had always been overlooked, but now she stood where one person could change the course of events. She told the guards that the gate mechanism was blocked and that the door would not open at his signal. The guards were confused. When iron is against you, courage diminishes. The scribe also tried to leave, but Elsa stepped toward him and said that she knew who really held the pen when it was time to strike with a sword, and that his hand betrayed his habit of holding iron, not a pen. The scribe cursed, but it was too late. He was tied up with straps. Lady Agnes stood up. She told the steward to say aloud, "In the year 1440, on this evening, when the symbol of dinner turned into a threat, the house chooses justice, not slaughter." She looked at Bran and Oliver and said that they were guests and would not be harmed within her walls until their intent was proven. She looked at Myron and said that he had saved not only them, but also the honor of the house, because blood on stone does not wash away until spring. Her voice was even and firm. The people felt fear give way to order, but the knight did not let go of the house so quickly. When the guards led the scribe to the dungeon, he broke free and rushed to the tray with the black head. He grabbed the knife that was used to scrape the resin and lunged at Myron. Leia managed to put her cane in the way, but the knife slipped and cut her palm. The blade dug into the edge of the tray, scattering pieces of salt, and a small roll of wax rolled out from under the resin. Elsa saw it rolling toward the edge and managed to catch it. The bundle contained a ring key to the storeroom above the gate and a scrap of paper with the name of the monk who had allegedly brought the order. This was the last missing link. The scribe was tied up more tightly. The treasurer sat down on a bench and did not raise his eyes. The steward announced that people could leave, and those who wanted to stay would remain as witnesses. But the hall was in no hurry to empty. Everyone wanted to understand what had happened that night. Lady Agnes ordered her brother to be summoned from the monastery. The guard who was sent was delayed by the sky. The night was as silent as the bottom of a well. Elsa offered her coachman and said that there was room for 2 in her carriage. She knew that time was against them. If the city started talking in the morning, and the truth was slow to come out, the lie would overtake it at the turn. They left before the first roosters crowed. Elsa, Miran, and Leia, whose arm was wrapped in a clean cloth. Malava stayed in the castle to keep the fears and whispers at bay. Adela watched the carriage go and thought that sometimes those who are considered small move stones that are beyond the power of those who sit high. She whispered to her mother that Myron was not just a kitchen boy. Lady Agnes nodded and said that it had been obvious for a long time. Dexterity in the hands always reveals the truth about the heart. The cart creaked along the morning road, fog settling on the wheels. Elsa said that in the monastery they should not look for the brother with the name from the scroll, but for the one who knows how to forge signatures on letters. She explained that the monastery wine cellar had recently received gifts from a merchant who had previously met with the treasurer. She added that money, like water, leaves traces. Miron listened and felt a strange clarity rising within him. He no longer wanted to be a shadow. He wanted to put his hand between the knife and someone else's throat. Cold and silence greeted them at the monastery. The gate opened when Elsa placed the purse in the gatekeeper's palm. Inside, it smelled of wax and damp stone. They found the brother whose name was on the scrap of paper. He said he never left the monastery after sunset, and that he was not carrying any orders. He added that a couple of days ago, a piece of the seal with which the monastery marked its letters had broken off, and now there was a scratch visible on the imprint. He said that the treasurer had come that same day, asked about the gifts, and kept an eye on the keys. He didn't realize that his words were adding up. Elsa thanked him, and they left. It was already too light outside for secret business. They hurried back. At that time, the castle was being barricaded and the shutters closed. The city woke up, and rumors spread through the market. Some said that the guests wanted to be executed. Others said that the guests wanted to execute the hostess. Still others said that God had given a sign so that people would remember that the house was held together by order. Malava walked from corner to corner and said that it was necessary to cool down those who liked to fan the flames. She tied a bag of herbs to Leah's wound and said that the pain would go away by evening. When the carriage returned, tables for the trial were already set up in the hall. Lady Agnes decided that the house would sort things out itself because an outside court would only intensify the feud. A group of respected people who knew that the truth is rarely convenient sat at the front. Elsa placed the scroll, the key, and the scrap of paper on the table. Miran recounted what he had seen in the cellar and in the scribe's room, and Leia described the conversation and showed where the people in gray cloaks had been standing. The brother from the monastery arrived with the gatekeeper and said that the seal had been damaged and the keys had disappeared for a while. The treasurer tried to explain that he had acted for the safety of the house, but his words unraveled like old canvas. In one place, he said he did not know about the package. In another, that he had checked it in the morning. Then he said that he had received the scroll from his brother. Then that he had found it in the scribe's room. Then Elsa asked Miron to read the lines from the scroll aloud, so that everyone could hear how the hand of the writer trembled. Miron did not read like a scholar. He read like a man who had held a knife many times and knew how metal felt in the palm of his hand. He showed where the letters were even and where the hand was searching for form, where the tail of the letter was broken in the forged signature, where the lines differed from the monastery's handwriting. People who could not read still heard the difference in breathing. They could not explain it, but they felt it. The judges exchanged glances. One of the elders said that a lie that comes into the house under the guise of honor is more dangerous than an enemy at the gate. He proposed to impose the maximum punishment and send the scribe to the monastery dungeon until the fair, where he would be handed over to the city court. At that moment, Bran rose and said through the steward that his family was ready to defend their honor with the sword. But now he saw that there was no place for the sword here, and that he recognized Agnes's house's right to this night. He asked for only one thing: to return the sign of the bull to his family, so that the shadow would be lifted from it. He was passionate, but his words conveyed something that people understand without an interpreter: the desire to break out of the cycle of bloodshed. Lady Agnes nodded and ordered the tray with the black head to be returned so that it could be washed and given to Bran's people. She said that symbols should not bind the hands of those who want peace. The treasurer fell to his knees and said he was afraid Bran's family would take power in the house when the lady was left alone. He said he thought he was doing the right thing by getting rid of them at night while no one would notice. He admitted that he had asked the scribe to get the seal from the monastery, and that he had replaced the lid in the cellar to let in the symbol that would frighten everyone. He thought that fear would see the matter through. He did not think that the cook would stand in his way. He didn't think the midwife would remember the old pendant. He didn't think the stone merchant would bring not stones, but a net that keeps the house from falling. He didn't think the lame maid would block the gate. He didn't think about people because he believed that seals and knives would decide everything. Miron stood nearby. He could have ordered the treasurer to be hanged on the gate. The scribe looked at him as if his eyes were asking for one thing: don't make an example of me, because I was only doing my job. Miron remembered the smoke in the kitchens, the nights spent poring over parchment, the words of the scribe teacher that patience is sharper than a knife. He remembered how the knife had cut the air near his face and how Leia had put her hand out. He thought that blood calls for blood, but the house calls for order. He said that his word was to spare the treasurer's life, but to take away his keys, his account books, and his right to speak on behalf of the house. He said that the scribe should be handed over to the city court because he loved other people's blood, and let him decide what evil deserved what punishment. He said that the house must go on. Otherwise, the black dinner would repeat itself like an echo. Lady Agnes accepted this. She ordered the treasurer's belts with keys to be removed and given to Leah until a new appointment was made. She ordered the books for the past year to be rewritten to understand where the money had gone. She offered Miran a place with the old scribe, if he agreed, because the house needed eyes that could see the difference between a living signature and a dead one. The old scribe, who had taught Myron to read, smiled with his toothless mouth and said that the boy had outgrown the kitchen. He said it was evident from the way he kept his word. The house began to breathe out. People went out into the yard, and the air became lighter. The raven that had been sitting on the roof since morning finally fluttered away and flew toward the field. In the kitchen, Malava brewed a strong infusion and gave it to Leia. Adela brought Miran some bread and said through a retelling that she thanked him from the bottom of her heart. She didn't dare say more because at moments like this, any extra words only get in the way. Elsa took off her rings and placed a single simple stone on the table. She said she would leave it in the house as a reminder that value is not always where the glitter is. The night passed, but the house listened to its own heart for a long time. The next day, people whispered about how the dinner ceremony had turned into a sentence, and how that sentence had been rejected by hands that no one considered strong. The servants touched the tray, washed of resin, and said that now this tray would only be used for bread. The gates were open for dinner, but Leia kept the key on her belt and checked the chains herself, trusting no one until order was restored. Her hand hurt, but she endured it because she knew that pain teaches you to look at things carefully. The old scribe brought Miran a stack of parchments. He said that there were holes in the books and that they needed to be sewn up. Miran sat down by the window and started from the beginning. He saw that in the month of Dnepr, more candles had been taken from the treasury than last year, and that the candles had been written off for memorial services that had not taken place. He saw that sacks of grain that were not listed in the parish regularly arrived at the tavern at the gate. He saw that the same hand had made entries for different people. He realized that the house had been losing blood through thin veins for a long time. He showed this to Lady Agnes, and she nodded. She said it would be difficult, but better difficult than walking on quicksand. Towards evening, Bran arrived at the castle again. He came without his retinue, with only one groom. He asked the steward to return the banner with the bull. Lady Agnes came out to him in the courtyard. She said that the house was giving a sign, but asked that the sign no longer be a knife. Bran bowed his head. He was young, but on that day he spoke like a man who had taken a step beyond pride. He asked to leave some of his men at the house for a week to help keep order while the treasurer's shadow was being hunted in the city. Lady Agnes agreed. Thus, enemies became allies for a day. People saw this not as weakness, but as strength. Meanwhile, a new rumor began to spread in the city. Someone said that the treasurer had a long-time debtor in the monastery who knew how to open other people's doors. Someone saw 2 gray cloaks walking away from the mill at night. Near the mill, they found an abandoned boot with a piece of green braid sewn inside, the same as the ribbon found in the kitchen that morning. Myron remembered the smell of incense and realized that the thread was a clue. He went to the mill with Leah. It was empty inside, but on the table lay a piece of wax with the imprint of that very seal. Only the rim was smudged. Myron said that this meant that the person was in a hurry and no longer cared about the cleanliness of the work. Leah found dried blood in a crack in the floor. Not animal blood, but human blood, by its color and smell. Someone had been helped to escape and had hit their foot. The trail led to the river. They walked along the shore, and the water flowed from stone to stone. On the shoal, a boy from a coastal village said that he had heard a splash at night and that a boat was going downstream. He said there were 2 people in the boat. He said that one of them was swearing and calling out the name of the man who yesterday had called himself a scribe. Myron returned to the castle and told the lady everything. She ordered the lower ford to be closed and a messenger to be sent to the town down the river. She said that if the culprits got away, the house would pay with fear for a long time. She knew the price of understatement. Towards evening, news came from the market. The scribe had been seen in the house of a merchant who kept a salt warehouse. The merchant was known for always shortchanging people on the weight of his salt. But no one complained because salt was used every day, and people were too bored to count the crumbs. Elsa said that this merchant had once helped take a man out of town when he was in debt. She said that the merchant liked to count other people's debts as his own. Lady Agnes nodded. She suggested making the move not with the guards, but with those whom no one noticed. She said that a cart with flour would go to the market tomorrow. Leah would sit next to the driver. Myron would be a scribe's apprentice, and Elsa would meet them at the warehouse gate. Their task was simple: to enter quietly and leave with the one for whom the house should never again remember the black tray. The morning was clear. The market smelled of fresh fish and hot flatbread. People laughed as if life had returned. The cart with flour stopped at the salt warehouse. Elsa stood nearby, sorting through the beads she sold to old women. Leah jumped down and asked the guard to let them through because the flour was needed for the merchant's bakery. The guard looked at her cane and thought it wasn't worth getting involved. They went inside. It was damp and quiet inside. At the far table sat a man with a bandaged arm, drinking water from a clay cup. It was the scribe. He had only just raised his eyes when Leah struck the table with her cane, sending the cup flying, and Myron grabbed a knife that was lying nearby and kicked him away. Elsa entered last and closed the door. The scribe looked at Myron and said that he wanted too much. He said that kitchen boys did not remove adults from the road. He said that the world was held together by those who had seals and keys. His words were not a threat. They were a sluggish habit of power. Myron replied that the world was held together by those who could tell the difference between bread and stone when a piece hit their teeth. He said that he would no longer spend his nights with other people's seals, but his days with his own books. The scribe tried to get up, but Leia put her cane on his shoulder. Elsa took out a rope and quickly tied him up. She said that the money he was paid smelled of the same incense as the ribbon in the kitchen. She said that the merchant would sell his friends for half a bag of salt if he smelled danger. And indeed the guard, hearing the noise, ran to the gate and in a minute brought 2 townspeople. They looked at the bound scribe and Elsa and said they were ready to escort them to the castle because they were tired of seeing the salt on their tables dwindle. The scribe was greeted silently at the castle. This time there were fewer people in the hall, but there was more attention in their eyes. The scribe realized that his network had fallen apart. He began to say what the treasurer had told him to say. He said that he thought, like the treasurer, that order was better than fear, and that it was better to shed blood once than to wait for the enemies to come. His voice sounded hollow. The old judge said that fear always seeks the short path, and truth the long one. He said that the house had chosen the long one. He ordered the scribe to be locked in a narrow tower until the city fair, as agreed. In the evening, Lady Agnes called Myron, Malava, Leia, and Elsa. She said that it had been a difficult day, but the house had stood firm. She said that now they had to do what was not obvious, but what held up the walls. Gather the grain into sacks, rewrite the names of those who served and those who received, and restore the people's faith in the scales. She said she wanted Myron to become the scribe's official apprentice, Leia a gatekeeper and tower guard, Malava a keeper of the keys to the medicine chest, and Elsa a friendly eye on the house. Elsa smiled and said she agreed, as long as the house remembered that the best stones were those you could stand on, not those that were pleasant to look at. A week passed. There were so many people at the fair that the square looked like a sea. The city court announced the clerk's sentence: exile to the farthest reaches, without the right to hold a pen or seal, under the supervision of people who know how to count bread. The treasurer was left alive, but deprived of the right to give orders and sent to a monastery to copy books. It was a lenient sentence on the surface, but for someone like him, it was worse than chains. His whole life depended on the movement of money, and now all he had left was to blacken his fingers with a pen. People said that justice came not with a fist, but with a step. That evening the table was set again in the castle. A large tray was placed in the middle, with white bread on it, and a bowl of honey next to it. Lady Agnes said that the symbol of dinner was different today, and that the house was welcoming peace. Bran and Oliver sat side by side, their faces calm. Adela looked at Myron and thought that sometimes fate gives a sign not in noise, but in the silence between notes. Malava stood by the wall and counted the candles. They were all burning evenly. Leia held the keys on her belt, and the metal jingled softly. Elsa placed that very simple stone in the middle of the table and said that it should remain there until the house forgot this lesson. Mirren looked at the people and remembered that first moment when the tray opened and the black head showed its teeth. He remembered how his hands trembled over the sealing wax. He thought that his place was next to books and seals, not next to a spit. He did not feel pride. He felt responsibility. He understood that the house was held together not by shouting and knives, but by small acts of loyalty. He saw Lady Agnes gesturing, Bran holding the cup without spilling a drop, Adela nodding to the old woman who brought a bag of herbs for Leia to the table. He saw Elsa checking to see if anyone was hiding a rope in their sleeve again. And he knew that even if someone tried to replace the lid again, there were now eyes and hands in the house that would notice a scratch on the seal. Outside the windows, a light evening breeze blew toward the castle. A raven sat on the roof again. But now, it did not seem like a bad omen. It was simply part of a world where everything had its place. Birds on the roof, bread on the table, keys with those who would not sell the house for a bag of salt, seals with those who knew how to keep a steady hand. People ate, and in every bite there was not the taste of victory, but the taste of order that had come through risk and choice. Another month passed. Myron rewrote the books, found the shortages, and named names. Some servants were fired, others were given a chance to redeem themselves. Leia fixed the gate mechanisms, lubricated the teeth, tightened the ropes, and taught 2 boys to look at iron, not as an enemy but as work. Malava cured several children who had been suffering from chest pains on autumn nights. Elsa left and returned with news that there were no longer any collectors taking extra goods on the road downriver. She said it was no miracle, but the work of people who were ashamed to take what did not belong to them under the new order. One evening, a gray-haired man in a cloak appeared at the gate. He asked to give Myron a small wooden box. Inside was a thin pendant with a bull's head and a small note. The note contained a few words. It said that the man who had once left the baby at the monastery had done so out of fear of the massacre, and that he had carried that fear like a stone throughout his life. He asked for forgiveness for that choice. He added that he now saw that the baby had grown into a man who had saved not only himself, but also his home. Myron read it and sat by the window for a long time. He felt neither anger nor the sweetness of forgiveness. He felt a straight line between the past and the present. He hung the pendant on a nail by the table, next to the pen and the knife for cutting parchment. In the year 1440, the house went through a ritual that could have been its downfall, but turned it into a lesson. The black dinner, intended as a sentence, became a door to order. The turning point came not because light came from heaven, but because several people made a choice. The midwife remembered an old sign. The stone merchant held out her purse in time. The lame maid stopped the iron. The kitchen boy read lies as others read prayers. And the mistress of the house chose justice over fear. The underestimated became heroes, and those who were accustomed to deciding with a seal and a knife were asked a simple question. What have you done for the house, besides what you considered your own? By nightfall, the gates were closed. A bowl of soup, a jug of water, bread and salt were placed on the table. Nothing superfluous. The house no longer liked unnecessary signs. Myron extinguished the candle in his room, found the pendant with his eyes, and placed his hand next to it. He thought that tomorrow there would be books and seals again, and that every day would now be a little less fearful and a little clearer. He fell asleep, and the raven on the roof rose again and flew away into the darkness, which no longer seemed bottomless. The house breathed evenly, like a person who had survived a fever and realized that to live is to put things in their place. Thus ended the story of the Black Dinner. It was not recorded in the official chronicles, because they love resounding victories there. But the walls remembered it, because walls hear the breath of those who live beneath them. And if someone ever brings a tray with a strange sign to the table again, in this house that person's hand will be stopped before the resin has time to crack, because now they know the value of every sign and every choice here, and harsh words are replaced by action only when there is no other way out. And this is justice, which does not like shouting, but loves order.